So, my first major electric skateboard backpacking trip over and done with. Now that the first major trip with my board is complete, I thought we could take a look at the entire trip as a whole. So, the entire trip was split into two portions. I did the first half last year, had to bail out on day 2, and then 10 months later, I went out and completed the rest of it. So, a total of 4 days on the trip when you stick both halves together. A total of 269 kilometers, works out to be an average of 67.4 kilometers per day. And I gotta tell you, the second half of this trip went a lot smoother than the first half, by far. Definitely one of the problems that was present in both the first and second half of this trip is gravel getting stuck in my drivetrain. It likes to get stuck in the gears on the wheels or the drive gear and cause the belt to slip, both when accelerating and braking, which can be dangerous if you're braking and you're not getting your full braking power. But it's also inefficient and leads to more battery being burned to get you up to speed. Not only does it, slow you down when you have to stop, take apart the drivetrain, and clean all of that stuff out, but also the gears on the wheels are plastic, so over time that wears them down. I've already had to replace them once. So on a short trip like this, it's not all that important, but if I were to do a longer trip, it's definitely something that has to be actively managed, and as soon as it's clear that there's something stuck in there, need to stop, need to clean it out, because I don't want to wear down my drivetrain into nubs. As for the wear and tear, it's definitely the drivetrain that gets the worst of it. Like, aside from the gears, the drive belts also get worn down a little bit. Just nicks and cuts and scrapes from gravel and stuff on the road pinging the belt as you're riding. Over time, it just causes tears and fissures in the belt that can spread and eventually tear the belt off completely. But it's not just that, the wheels themselves are also starting to show wear and tear. They've got a bunch of chips and cracks in the urethane. Wheels are perfectly fine right now, but over time the cracks will get bigger and more pieces will start to flake off. The deck itself is actually holding up just fine. That's the benefit of using a high quality deck. I do try and take care of it. I don't expose it to water. It's taken a few bumps here and there when I've dropped the board, but other than that, I tend to baby it. Grip tape's still good, there's no loosening of the bolts where everything's bolted through the board. But one thing that is starting to get chewed through that surprised me is the actual motor covers themselves. Just so much gravel and other debris on the road banging against it, it's starting to actually wear it down and bend it a little bit in towards the belt, which is worrisome in that if it gets pushed in too far, it'll start to actually push against the belt and cause premature wear on that. Aside from that, the only other real wear and tear that I could see is just the wiring that connects the battery case to the underside. I just glued it to the deck, and every so often that glue comes unstuck and the wires are just free floating. But there's so much glue on the wires that it just kind of holds shape even though it's not actually directly attached to the deck. Kind of funny. But I'll keep an eye on that and just make sure it doesn't get any worse. Going back to where I said I had a much easier time on the second half of this trip compared to the first half, the type of terrain that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis has a huge effect on how far you manage to get in a given day, right? Like on my last day, I blew through 88 kilometers, and including a charging stop in the middle, I managed to make it to my destination by 6 o'clock p.m. Whereas in the first half of the trip, man, I was struggling to make, I think I managed to barely do 40 kilometers by the end of the day at about 3 o'clock. So remember that tool that I made that's basically just a handle with some cordage attached to it that I loop around my truck so I can pull my skateboard when I can't ride it? That turned out to be a very, very useful tool. I'm very proud of myself for that one. That is definitely a mainstay in my skatepacking kit going forward. So in the entirety of this trip, obviously I wound up staying in motels the entirety of the trip. I mean, I only spent 2 nights technically out on the road, so it was only 2 nights in a motel, but still. The motel that I wound up staying at on the second half of this trip was really expensive. It wound up being $230 for 1 night. That's my own fault for not making a note of the prices for the various motels when I was planning out the legs of my trip. I definitely need to make a note of that beforehand so that it's in my list of possible overnight locations in my legs. As well, I did have the option of looking at different motels in the area, but I stupidly just decided to say okay and then wound up booking a night at that really expensive Comfort Inn. I had plenty of time to try and find a cheaper alternative. I would just peg that to laziness. Was too tired at the end of that first day and just went with the option that I had set as my destination. Like I said, this is my first really long expedition on my DIY electric skateboard that I made specifically for these sorts of trips. I already knew it was going to be a smart decision, but man, do I appreciate having that top mounted battery case. That makes swapping the battery take all of 3 seconds, as opposed to stopping, unbolting the battery case from the bottom of the deck, changing the battery, bolting everything on. That takes like 20-30 minutes. The only downside is you have to be careful of your foot placement, as you have that big box square in the middle of the deck. But that's exactly why I chose such a long deck in the first place, so that I have plenty of foot room on either end with space for my battery box. And the added benefit of such a long deck is that it gives me really good stability so that I can absorb impacts from unexpected road debris or cracks in the pavement and stuff like that. I have a much easier time absorbing those types of impacts and hard braking. And one of the smart things that I decided to do on the second half of this trip, that I'll probably do in all of my backpacking trips going forward, is I took it easy on the first day back. On the first half of this trip, I did the opposite. I tried to push over 100 kilometers on the first day. That did not work out very well at all. And this time around, I dropped it all the way down and only did one leg on the first day. And that, I think, was a huge contributing factor to why the second half of this trip went so much more smoothly. I got to my destination super early in the day, let me relax, let me get into the swing of things, gave my feet a chance to relax after the first day back riding on that board for so long. And I found that on the second day, it was a much easier adjustment than on the second day during the first half of the trip. So I didn't explicitly call it out on the second half of this trip, but I did make a few gear changes. Most notably, you would have saw that I was using my 65-liter Osprey pack for this part of the trip, as opposed to the Amazon 55-liter. The reason I went with the larger capacity pack is I just find that it sits nicer on me. Plus, with the Amazon pack, I'm always fighting with the friggin' straps. The other thing was I finally ditched the inflatable air mattress for warm weather use, and I now have a Z-Lite SOL foam pad. Knowing that I just have to pull that out of my pack and toss it and it's good to go. No unrolling it, no inflating it, no making sure there's no embers or pokey things coming at it. That's another huge peace of mind. So yeah, this trip was definitely a good warm-up for these sorts of electric skateboard backpacking trips. I have much more in the pipeline. I've got a 500 kilometer trip that I'm planning as my next one. More on that soon. Stay tuned so that you see that. And that's it for this one, guys. I will catch you next video.